Good morning, everyone. Thanks again for joining us. Before we begin, we are going to begin with a land acknowledgement. So we would like to begin this meeting recognizing and honoring the Abenaki people. We acknowledge this shared learning takes place on the unceded traditional homeland of the Abenaki people, past and present. We recognize that colonism and the oppression of Native peoples is a current and ongoing process, and we commit to building our awareness of our present participation and work to end it. We acknowledge and honor with gratitude the land, the waterways, and the people who have stewarded them throughout the generations. We ask you to join us in acknowledging the past, present, and future Abenaki elders who have lived, currently live, and will live in this space. We also want to acknowledge the erasure and exclusion of the Abenaki Nation in this space, physically, culturally, and ideologically. We also acknowledge that our state has benefited from the uncompensated and exploited labor represented in the legacy of slavery and the present day reality of migrant farm workers. Let us use our spheres of influence as courageous conversations learners to rebuild our understanding of history in a way that amplifies the voices and lived experience of the marginalized people, past, present, and future. So good morning, everyone, and welcome back to Courageous Conversations. This is session 2, and we are so thrilled to have you all here. This is the session when we get into the meat of the material. And so hopefully all of you have listened to the On Being podcast that was assigned, because this conversation is going to be based on just that. And so that podcast was a conversation between Krista Tippett and Lucas Johnson. And I feel like it is really important to point out the role that Lucas plays at On Being and how it connects with us. And so Lucas Johnson leads the On Being's project work in social healing as the executive director of civil conversations and social healing. So that conversation that they had in that podcast is are doing the work that we are doing here today. And so it's so exciting to be doing this work with you as Vermonters and maybe some New Hampshire folks here. I don't know, all the people, you're all welcome. But we're doing it here in our little sphere of influence with each other. So before we get started, I wanted to do a couple of housekeeping things. Number one is you will receive a weekly email that has the recording from the previous session, as well as the homework assignment in preparation for the next session. And that's going to be it. And I'll also always be attaching those grounding virtues and the welcome letter from Krista Tippett. And if there's anything else you need, please let Shalini and I know. And if any resources come up during the session, I'll try to attach those to the email as well. Also, we are currently recording right now, but I will be shutting the recording off when the discussion begins. So when you get the recording, it will be of Xusana's presentation, just like last week you got Brian's presentation, and that was it. And then just a reminder, and I'm not going to go through these in detail because you have them in your email, and I'll just keep on sending them until you get sick of me sending them. But the grounding virtues, because that is where we always want to come back to. We always want to bounce our ideas and our thoughts and our feelings off of these grounding virtues. So I'll just read them off without going into detail. They are words that matter, hospitality, humility, patience, generous listening, and adventurous civility. So if you have not gone over those grounding virtues, read them after we finish here. And it just brings so much depth to the conversations we're having. Okay, so I neglected to introduce myself, which I always do. I'm Molly Stone, the artistic director at Catamount Arts. And now I'm going to kick it to my colleague, Shalini, and she will introduce herself and our special guest.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Shalini Suryanaraina. I'm so happy to be here with all of you today. Molly and I have been working on this series for quite some time, and it's really thrilling to see it coming to life and to be here with all of you. So without wasting another minute, I'd like to tell you a little bit about our featured speaker today. We're pleased to introduce Xusana Davis, who serves as the state of Vermont's first executive director of racial equity. She was appointed to the position in June of 2019 by Governor Scott. And in a state that's approximately 94% white, her job is to bring our state government closer to equity so that all Vermonters have equal access to state services. That alone is a daunting task, but you have to keep in mind she's doing that with the backdrop of 400 years of racism. So Xusana's addressing issues. Oh, she's also addressing issues that go beyond race to other areas like disabilities, sexual orientation, gender. So it's a very mighty set of tasks by any standard. And luckily, she is a mighty woman. Xusana was born in White Plains, New York, the second child and first daughter of parents who had immigrated from the Dominican Republic. So she's a first-generation US-born Latina. She's fluent in Spanish, and her first name is spelled Xusana and pronounced like the song, Oh, Susanna. She got her law degree from New York Law School with a concentration in international human rights law. And while she was at school, she also directed a civil liberties education program for low-income and minority youth. When she was interviewed by V.T. Digger about that, she said, "My goal was to use what I learned for good, to be an attorney for good, in the public interest. I did not realize that I was interested in policy making, and legislation until I took my second internship at the New York Civil Liberties Union. I was a legislative fellow, and I thought it was going to be boring. And it turned out to be one of the best and most formative experiences that I had in law school in terms of understanding where I saw myself in the public good." So among other things, her internships taught Xusana that there was more than one way to use her law degree. The final quote I want to share with you from Xusana leads perfectly into our Courageous Conversation session. When she was asked about her move to Vermont, she said, this was early in 2020, she said, "Well, it's 2020 and we live in a state that's 94% white, so it's subjectively true that we're not doing great on diversity. But I do applaud the state for being decisive and wanting to take this issue on. I think time is really going to tell how seriously we take this work. The real test comes when we've identified points of systemic racism and how we choose to address them. I think it's easy for people to say, I want to do more. I want to be equitable about diversity. But when it's time to actually do the work, are we just talking or are we doing the work?" So being part of this Courageous Conversations activity is a way for us to keep doing the work. And it's a chance for us to learn from and with Xusana. So with that, I will turn it over to the incomparable Xusana Davis.
All right. Thank you, Shalini, for that very generous introduction. And hola, buenos días, everybody. So happy to be with you at 9 o'clock on a Sunday. There is nowhere I would rather be than talking to you about everybody's favorite subject, racism. Yeah. So I know that our time is quite limited today, and I'm not going to do that thing I do where I spend too much time talking and poorly managing the time. So let's just jump right in. We all listened to, well, actually, no, I'm sorry. First, I also need to acknowledge and show gratitude for the invitation to be here. This series is really impressive, and I'm very honored to be part of it, and honored that you all could find time in your day and in your week and in your weekend to spend it having this conversation. So thank you all, and thank you to the organizers. So we all listened to this episode of On Being, and I know you all probably have lots of thoughts. I have lots of thoughts, but you know, in listening to it and reflecting on it, I ended up with kind of three main takeaways. I'd like to leave you with those three main takeaways. And I find that all three of them are actually things that I say a lot. So it feels very much like a reinforcement of truth. And I guess we have to acknowledge also this episode was recorded right after George Floyd had been murdered. And so one thing that I noticed in the conversation was the fact that there was a lot of open space, just a lot of silence and a lot of stumbling over the words, right? I know that that show has a long history, is very well regarded, and the host is eloquent and knowledgeable and sharp, and yet she was at such a loss for words. And I'm seeing nods around the room. I think you all kind of picked up on that, right? And her guest, Lucas, I mean, I don't know if any of you read his bio, but my goodness, I don't know how he sleeps. He's doing so much work. He's been around the world, Italy and Germany, and working with the UN and starting initiatives, and member of the faith community, and a person of color who's been doing equity work for so many years. And even he appeared stuck, right? Which I think tells us so much about, first of all, the expectation that we have of people with lived experience to have all the answers. But I think if it was up to us and what we wanted, we wouldn't be dealing with this kind of stuff today, right? It's not about having the answers or having all the power. It's about the seeding and the sharing of that power for good. But that's not even one of the 3 takeaways. I guess that's just a bonus reflection, top of the dome. But I do want to just name explicitly the 3 takeaways I'd like to leave you with. And they are as follows. Number 1, and I said this, and I think the last time I said it, I thought I was being a little bit brusque. I was at the Vermont Land Trust annual meeting, and I said, you already know the answer. And at the time I thought, ooh, was that mean? But then later someone came and said, that was so moving. So I'm going to keep saying it. Hope you don't mind. And I'll explain what I mean by these. But number 1, you already know the answer. Number 2 is we and us changes contextually and over time. I'll get back to that one as well. And the third one is, yes, listen and learn, but also do. So I'll jump right into them. The first one on you already know the answer. You know, this particular episode was titled When No Question Seems Big Enough. And I think what the host and her guest were struggling with was, in order to find the right answers for justice, what question should we even be asking? Who should be asking the question, and whose responsibility is it to provide a real answer? And there was one thing in particular that Lucas said that really stuck with me. He said that willful ignorance has cost other people their lives. And I often hear this in conversations around equity when I hear people say, well, what do we do? What do we do? In the case of, just as an example, the Land Trust, when I said that statement last year, you know, the question was, we have all this land that's actually unceded Abenaki territory. What should we do to be racially equitable? You know what to do. You know the answer. It's just hard. The answer is hard, right? We live in a country where, in the middle of a murder trial for one officer who murdered a person on camera, in the middle of that trial, there's been an average of 3 police killings a day since that trial began on March 25th. We can't stop having our cops murder people for long enough to hear testimony about one cop who murdered a person. And then people throw their hands up and say, what do we do, America? You know what to do. You know the answer. And so again, it's not that we don't know the answers, it's that the answers are hard, right? But again, as Lucas tells us in this episode of On Being, willful ignorance is costing people their lives. In other words, when we do, in Spanish, we have a saying, hacerse el chivo, which translates to acting like the goat, which means acting like you don't know what's going on. Playing dumb is what it means, right? So the more that we act like the goat and play dumb about what kinds of changes and reforms are needed, the more lives get extinguished in our country, because the answers are there. They're just hard. And so we pretend not to know what they are, but we know what they are. So that was the first thing I wanted to reflect on. The second thing was, you know, they moved into a conversation about we and us. Who is we? Who is us? Are we allowed to say we and us? I think Krista was really wrestling with the idea of, am I part of the we as a white woman, right? And I really felt that resonated with me, because we and us changes, not just vis-a-vis different people, but also within the same person over time. What do I mean by that? Well, I'm part of the we when it comes to women. I experience a lot of discrimination based on sex in society, but I'm also part of the we when it comes to people of color. And for example, when we think about things like affirmative action, people often think of, young Black male basketball player in college or something. A lot of people say, well, you took my spot at this college just because you're brown. Many people in America don't realize that the #1 beneficiary group of affirmative action policies in education and employment is white women, who are paradoxically some of its most ardent opponents. So when we think about the we and the us, I'm part of the we when it comes to womanhood, but I'm also part of the we when it comes to people of color. And statistically speaking, I am less likely to get a callback, a job offer, or a spot in a school than an equally or less qualified white counterpart who's also woman identified. And so, yes, we're part of the we, but we're also not part of the we at different, vis-a-vis different people. I think about the women's suffrage movement in the United States and how it had a major racism problem. Suffrage, temperance, and civil rights had a deep and complicated history. And I'm going to put a link to a wonderful article about that in the chat momentarily. And I also think about, I'm thinking about that like on the women's suffrage, women's rights, but with a deep tinge of racism. And Bell Hooks has a beautiful piece, Ain't I a Woman, right? And then I think about it from the reverse. I think about the civil rights movement, led primarily by African Americans in this country, and the deep sexism that was embedded in some parts of that too. I think about the March on Washington, where women in the community were recruited to march and to serve as singers and organizers, but were denied the opportunity for speaking roles, were denied the opportunity to march alongside the men or in the front. Coretta Scott King was not permitted to march next to her husband at the march. She was acknowledged in a group of very general women as the wives of the leaders. But many who had prominent voices, people like Rosa Parks, who, by the way, was not the first woman of color to refuse to give up her seat on a bus. It was a young woman who's 16 years old, Claudette Colville, currently lives in Co-op City in the Bronx. But as we do with many cases in America, she was not the ideal plaintiff to be the face of the bus boycott movement because she was a teen mother. Therefore, she was part of the we when it came to getting dragged off a bus by officers, but not part of the we when it came to leadership because she was a teen mom. So that's the we vis-a-vis other people. And then there's the we over time within ourselves. And this is a big one that many of us miss. Oftentimes, I think like before 2007, we think about our positionality in society, right? Before 2007, when everything was good and when you could make $30,000 a year and get a home loan for $600,000, right? And then 2007 hit, and people who thought they were safe and well off and had pensions and nest eggs, suddenly the bottom fell out from under them. And they went from being haves to being have-nots. Look at the last year. People who had never been food insecure suddenly found themselves on long, hours-long lines at food shelves around the country, right? People who grow up as athletes and just able-bodied people. Someone goes up a one-way street and you're in an accident and now you're a member of the disability community overnight. You weren't part of that we and us yesterday, but you are today. People who don't consider themselves members of the LGBTQIA+ population, and then their beautiful child comes out as trans or pansexual or what have you. You're part of a different we now, right? And so sometimes I think that we see our roles in society as static. I'm a white person, and therefore I identify with white people until my kid brings home a mixed race grandchild. And suddenly I fear for that baby's life because I know what it's like in America. And so that's the second takeaway, and I think I'm already over time, but just the fact that we and us changes contextually, not just within the same person, but also vis-a-vis other people. And this is really important because it's not about whether you're allowed to say we and us because you're this identity or you're white, but wait a minute, but technically speaking, my last name is Rodriguez, and maybe that. Focus less on the belonging for technical reasons, right? Focus less on your membership card and more on the role that you're playing. You know, I think about my best friend, the person closest to me in the world, who grew up in a household of activists. His father was an environmental activist at a time when it wasn't cool yet to be one, and he was a person of color in the South, and was advocating against the dumping of chemicals that was infiltrating a local school, a school where Black children were going to school, and there were actually parents who said, "Well, why does he care? His kids don't even go to this school." And I think about it, and you know, it's really amazing. And I'm saying this to say that, you know, sometimes we focus so much on the membership card without realizing if you're doing the work for the movement for the right reasons, you can say we as a white person. I mean, you know, don't be too liberal about it, but you know what I mean. But the point is, it's less about the technicalities and more about the role that we're playing. So that's the second thing in terms of identity and community and we and us. And the last thing that I wanted to say was the listening and the learning. You know, after George Floyd was murdered on camera by the government, one of the things that I heard from white people most, if I had a bingo card of ally phrases, the one that would light up the most would be, I just know we have to listen more and learn more. We've got to listen and learn. I just want to listen. I want to do the hard work of listening and learning. And that's beautiful. It really is. And I want you to listen and I want you to learn. But more than that, more than anything, I need you to do. Because the thing is, and this goes back to takeaway number one, you know the answer. So there's only so much that you have to listen and learn. Let me catch you up. It's 2021. Let me catch you up on the last 4 to 6 centuries in the United States. There were brown people here. They were subjected to ethnocide through biological warfare and straight up violence. Then more brown people were trafficked from other parts of the world, forced into labor. And ever since then, they and other brown people have been repeatedly and continually oppressed and murdered. You're caught up. That's it. Hello, it's welcome to America, right? You're all caught up. So beyond that, the other listening and learning to do is technical stuff, it's details. But the real core of your role should be the doing, and that's important. And what does that mean? That means, hey, if I don't like the way that my local police handles certain cases, well, guess what? My sheriff is an elected representative. I have a voice in whether that person keeps his or her job, right? I can go to my select board or to the police chief in my town and say, do we meet the minimum standard for fair and impartial policing in the state of Vermont? Do we exceed the standard? If not, why not? What are we doing on top of it, right? You have that power. And believe it or not, when angry white people come in and start making demands at town hall, people listen. So use that privilege and that power for good. The other thing that you have to do is once you do your listening and learning, a big responsibility, once your eyes are opened, and I think all of you have open eyes just by virtue of the fact that you're here, but once you've done that learning and you've become awakened to the injustice, the real responsibility is now upon your shoulders. You've got to each one teach one, right? You have to now be ambassadors and envoys of that message. It's not enough for you to know in your heart, I'm a good person. I am not a racist because I read Audre Lorde or I read James Baldwin twice, right? I sponsored a Fresh Air Fund kid, so I'm a good white person. Well, have you preached the gospel of anti-racism lately to anyone in your community? And your community could be your physical, regional, geographic community. It could be your family. It could be the knitting and crochet forum that you frequent as you look for new sweater patterns that you're never going to finish, and they just stay there half done in your closet. This is getting personal. So, you know, it is very much about the doing, and the doing doesn't have to be beyond your reach. Start with what you know. Are you a former educator? Are you a current educator? Start with that. Maybe you have a teacher in your life. Buy them a set of, you know, anti-racism flashcards to use in their classroom. Are you an attorney who has spare time on your hands? Maybe you're semi-retired. Take a couple of pro bono cases. Help people draft something, you know. Maybe you are an artist. Maybe you're a painter, formally or informally. Offer to do a mural for the town or something like that. Do an art installation. Or maybe you run a not-for-profit or some other organization. Maybe you're a school administrator. Have an essay contest for your students to bring awareness on an issue. It is now what, April? You've got 10 whole months to learn about leaders who are not MLK, Malcolm X, Sojourner Truth, or Harriet Tubman until next Black History Month. That's a lot of time for you to learn about other people. So there are lots of things that you can do that are within your reach. The important thing is that you do. I am done, I think. And I would love to hear less from myself and more from you all. So I'm gonna let Molly and Shalini navigate the blue hand raising function, but if you also have items in the chat that you'd like to share, maybe you're not one of those in-camera people, that's fine. But please do share your reflections. Is there something I've said that either doesn't make sense or you want to call BS on? Maybe there's something that stuck out to you from the On Being episode you'd like to highlight. Whatever it is that you're thinking, please do share. Otherwise, thank you so much for your time.
So folks, thank you, Xusana, so much.